Construction work pays well enough back home, but when I saw the posting for a crew to build a new research base in Antarctica, the numbers were too good to pass up. 6 months of work for a year's salary. I thought, how bad could it be? We flew in during the last clear days of summer. The landscape was barren, endless stretches of ice and rock, under a sky that seemed to swallow you whole. The cold hit me the moment we landed, even though I was wrapped in layers of gear. It was an all-consuming kind of cold, the kind that gets into your bones and stays there. Our crew was small. Me, Paul, Jack, Luis, Greg, and Carl. We were all hardened guys, used to long hours, heavy lifting, and harsh conditions. Antarctica was just another job site, just colder, or so we thought. The first couple of weeks were routine. We set up camp not far from where the new base would be built. It was basic, just prefab huts, a small mess hall, a generator, and the essential tools to keep us running. We were isolated, miles from the nearest outpost, but we didn't think much of it. After all, it wasn't our first time being cut off from civilization for work. The land we were building on looked pristine. White, untouched snow stretching for miles. No sign of wildlife, just the wind whistling across the ice. The silence was unnerving at first. You could go hours without hearing anything other than the crunch of snow under your boots or the occasional snap of ice in the distance. By the end of the third week, things started to feel off. Paul, our lead, was the first to notice. It wasn't anything obvious. Just little things. He said he was feeling sluggish, more tired than usual. At first, we chalked it up to the cold, maybe dehydration. Down here, it's easy to forget to drink enough water, with the dry air sucking the moisture out of you. But even after he upped his intake, he wasn't getting better. Paul wasn't the type to complain. If anything, he was the toughest of the group. The kind of guy who could work a 16-hour shift and still have enough energy for a beer at the end. But now, he was always sitting down, rubbing his eyes, or complaining of headaches. Then came the vomiting. First, just nausea, which we all assumed was due to the altitude or a bug. But by the end of week 4, Paul was struggling to keep anything down. We had a small medical kit, just the basics. But nothing seemed to help. Luis gave Paul some painkillers, but it didn't touch the headaches. Then one morning, Paul came into the mess hall and sat down with this weird look on his face. He reached up and pulled off a clump of hair, just like that. No pain, no pulling. It just came away in his hand. We all stared, too stunned to speak. Paul tried to laugh it off, but there was fear in his eyes. "Guess I'm balding early, huh?" he joked, but no one laughed. Within a few days, it wasn't just Paul. Jack was next, complaining of intense fatigue and joint pain. He said his gums hurt too, and when he showed us, his teeth looked loose, like they weren't quite sitting right in his mouth. His lips were cracked, bleeding. I figured it was just the cold, but we'd been out here for weeks by then, and we'd all gotten used to it. Why now? Luis started getting nosebleeds, bad ones. He'd be in the middle of a conversation, and suddenly, blood would start pouring down his face. He'd laugh it off, make some joke about the dry air, but none of us could shake the feeling that something was wrong. The burns started appearing not long after. Little red patches on our arms and faces, like sunburns, but there was no sun. At first, we thought it was frostbite, but frostbite doesn't feel like this. The burns stung, deep under the skin, and they didn't heal. Greg tried slathering ointment on them, but it didn't help. The patches grew, spreading across our bodies, blistering and peeling. We couldn't understand it. Why were we getting burned in the coldest place on Earth? Then came the night we found the first barrel. Carl and I were out checking the perimeter, making sure none of our equipment had iced over, when he tripped on something under the snow. He cursed, kicked at the object, and the snow fell away, revealing rusted metal. We stopped, confused, and started digging it out with our hands. It was an old barrel, its metal corroded, the paint long faded, but there were markings on it, symbols we didn't recognize, painted in faded yellow. It looked like it had been there for decades, buried under layers of ice and snow. We called the others over and dug up more. One by one, we unearthed them, scattered around the site like a minefield. There were dozens, hundreds maybe. Greg knelt down, brushing off the snow to reveal the symbols. He froze, his face turning pale. "These are radiation symbols," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. At first, none of us believed it. We couldn't. This was a construction site, not some nuclear testing ground. But the more we looked, the clearer it became. These barrels were old, rusting, and leaking something, some kind of residue that stained the snow a faint, sickly yellow. Luis started coughing. Paul was too weak to even stand at that point. Jack was losing more teeth every day, and we all had burns, patches of hair falling out. That's when it hit us. We weren't just sick, we were poisoned. Radiation poisoning. The realization hit us like a freight train. We'd been working, eating, sleeping on a radioactive dump site for weeks. God knows how much we'd absorbed, how much had seeped into our skin, our lungs, our bones. We needed to get out, fast. But when we ran back to the station, desperate to call for help, we found that the radio was dead. Not just the radio, everything. The generator was still running, but every piece of electronic equipment was fried, useless. We tried to fix it, but there was no point. The radiation had corroded the circuits, fried the wires. We were cut off, with no way to call for help and no way to escape. Panic set in. We started fighting, yelling at each other, blaming one another for the mess we were in. But deep down, we all knew it didn't matter whose fault it was. The damage was done. We were stranded, poisoned, and dying. And there was no one coming to save us. Paul was the first to go. We found him in his bunk, his skin pale and cracked, his hairless scalp dotted with blisters. He'd stopped breathing sometime in the night. We didn't know what to do with him. We couldn't bury him. There was no ground to dig into, just ice. So we left him in the cold storage unit, hoping the low temperatures would keep him from rotting. But that didn't stop the smell. That sickly sweet odor of decay seeped into the station, clinging to everything. One by one, we all started fading. Luis stopped eating, too weak to even lift a spoon. Jack was delirious, muttering to himself, his mouth a bloody mess of loose teeth and swollen gums. Greg just sat in the corner, staring at the barrels outside the window, whispering about the invisible death that was killing us. We've been abandoned. I know it now. No one's coming for us. We're too far out, and the storms are too bad. Even if they did come, by the time they got here, we'd all be dead. My skin is blistering now, peeling away in layers. Every breath feels like I'm inhaling fire. I can't write much longer. My hands are shaking too badly. The others are gone. Luis died yesterday. Greg wandered out into the snow a few days ago, and Jack's too far gone to even notice. If anyone finds this, please, don't let them build here. Don't let anyone else suffer the way we did. We never stood a chance. The storm had been raging for days. Thick sheets of snow and ice lashed the windows of the weather station, blocking out everything but the howling wind. The five of us, me, Eric, Miles, Stevenson, and Frank, had been stuck in this outpost for nearly 6 months already, and the isolation was starting to wear thin. Hollow Point was one of the most remote stations on the continent, perched on the edge of a frozen cliff overlooking the vast, unforgiving ice fields. The nearest human contact was 1,000 kilometers away. It was supposed to be routine, monitor the weather systems, collect data, report back to the mainland. But as the weeks dragged on, the silence gnawed at us. Eric was the first to notice something was off. He was our lead technician, a quiet, no-nonsense kind of guy. Always dependable, but prone to overthinking things. It started small. He'd complain about hearing noises at night, things shuffling around in the walls. None of us took him seriously at first. This place was full of creaks and groans, especially when the wind hit the station hard. "You're just imagining it, man," Stevenson would say, laughing it off. "It's the wind. This whole place is falling apart." Eric didn't laugh. He wasn't the kind to joke around. "It's not the wind," he'd mutter. "It sounds like something's moving in the walls, like someone's walking around in the ducts." After a while, even I started hearing it. At night, when everything was quiet, I'd hear faint tapping sounds or the shuffle of feet. But every time I'd get up to check, there was nothing. I convinced myself it was just the building settling, or maybe animals, small rodents burrowing in the walls. But in Antarctica, it didn't make sense. Miles, our meteorologist, was too focused on his data to care. He was obsessed with the storm outside, tracking every fluctuation in the wind speed, logging it like it was the only thing keeping him sane. Frank, on the other hand, wasn't handling it well. He was supposed to be in charge, our commanding officer, but the isolation had gotten to him early on. He'd lock himself in his room for days, coming out only to eat or check the equipment. His face was pale, his eyes hollow. The rest of us had learned to ignore him. Stevenson kept things running, and I focused on my own work. But then things started getting weird. It was about 3 weeks into the storm. By then, the wind was a constant roar, rattling the station to its bones. I was in the mess hall, eating dinner alone. Stevenson and Eric were working on the generator, which had been acting up again, and Frank was, well, wherever Frank usually was. Suddenly, the lights flickered. Not unusual given the storm, but this time they didn't come back on. I sat there in the darkness, waiting for the backup power to kick in. The station was equipped with an emergency generator, but for some reason, it wasn't starting. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way toward the control room, the beam of light bouncing off the narrow metal walls as I moved. That's when I heard it. A soft thump, followed by a dragging sound. I froze, straining to listen. The noise was coming from the storage room, just down the hall. My pulse quickened. I wasn't alone. "Stevenson?" I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. I stepped closer to the door, my hand gripping the handle tightly. Slowly, I pushed it open, the rusty hinges creaking. The beam of my flashlight swept the room, illuminating shelves of supplies, stacks of boxes, and something hunched in the corner. It was Frank. His back was to me, his body crouched low, his hands digging through a pile of rotten food that had been left too long in storage. I recoiled at the stench. It was overwhelming, a thick, rancid odor that made my stomach churn. But Frank didn't seem to notice. He was shoving handfuls of the spoiled food into his mouth, his fingers slick with decay. "Frank!" I shouted, my voice thick with shock and disgust. "What the hell are you doing?" He didn't respond. He just kept eating, his movements frantic, like he couldn't stop. His shoulders trembled, and I could hear him muttering something under his breath, words I couldn't make out. I stepped forward, grabbing his arm. "Frank, stop it!" That's when he turned to face me. His eyes, God, his eyes were wild, bloodshot, and glazed over, like he wasn't even there. His face was smeared with the rotting mess, chunks of meat and bread falling from his lips as he snarled at me. For a moment, I froze. This wasn't Frank, not the man I knew. Without warning, he lunged at me, knocking me to the ground. The flashlight skittered across the floor, casting jagged shadows as we struggled. He was stronger than I expected, his grip iron tight around my throat as he tried to pin me down. I gasped for air, kicking him off me and scrambling to my feet. Frank staggered back, breathing heavily, his eyes locked on mine. There was something in his expression, a flicker of fear, or maybe pain, just before he collapsed. His body hit the floor with a sickening thud, and he lay there, convulsing, his hands twitching uncontrollably. I grabbed the flashlight and bolted out of the room, my heart racing. I found Eric and Stevenson in the generator room, frantically trying to get the power back on. "Something's wrong with Frank," I shouted, barely able to get the words out. Eric glanced up, his face pale. "What do you mean?" He's gone crazy. He's in the storage room, eating the food, rotting food. He attacked me." Stevenson looked at me like I was the one who had lost it. "Are you sure, man? That doesn't make any sense. I'm telling you, something's wrong. We need to get him to sick bay or something." The lights flickered back on then, casting the station in an eerie yellow glow. Without another word, we rushed back to the storage room, but when we got there, Frank was gone. The mess was still there, the rotten food scattered across the floor, but Frank had disappeared. We found him later, curled up in his bunk, trembling, his skin cold and clammy. He didn't respond when we tried to talk to him, just muttered incoherently, his eyes darting around the room as if he was seeing things that weren't there. Over the next few days, things only got worse. Frank barely ate, barely slept. He would wander the halls at night, talking to himself, staring at the walls like he could see something the rest of us couldn't. We tried everything, medication, restraints, but nothing worked. And then the voices started. At first, it was just Frank. He'd sit in his bunk, talking to someone who wasn't there, calling them by name. "She's here," he'd say. "She's watching us." But soon, we all started hearing it. The tapping in the walls, the whispers in the dark. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night, convinced that someone was standing over me, breathing softly in the dark. But every time I'd turn on the light, there was no one there. Eric started losing it next. He'd stay up late, pacing the halls, muttering to himself. "It's not just Frank," he'd say. "There's something in this place. Something's wrong." Stevenson tried to keep things under control, but even he was fraying at the edges. We were all on edge, snapping at each other over nothing, constantly checking the doors, the windows. It felt like the station itself was closing in on us, suffocating us. And Frank just got worse. He'd stopped eating entirely, his body wasting away, his eyes hollow and sunken. He'd sit in the corner of the room, rocking back and forth, mumbling about her, the one he claimed was watching us. We found him dead in the storage room a week later. He'd somehow gotten in there again, despite the locks we'd put on the door. His body was curled up in the corner, surrounded by piles of rotten food, his hands clutching his stomach like he'd tried to eat himself to death. His face was twisted in pain, his mouth stained with decay. There was no explanation, no reason for any of it. We called in the mainland, but the storm made communication impossible. We were stuck, alone, in the freezing wasteland, with no way out and no answers. Now it's just me and Stevenson. Eric's gone too, wandered off into the storm a few nights ago, and we haven't seen him since. The whispers are getting louder, the tapping more frequent. And sometimes, I think I see her too, the one Frank kept talking about. Maybe she's always been here, waiting, watching. Antarctica was the last place I thought I'd ever see. The contract was for 6 months, isolated at a remote station with a team of 5, maintaining equipment through the long, dark winter. I didn't mind the solitude. I thought it might even be nice, a break from the chaos back home. Besides, the money was too good to pass up. We arrived just before the last supply ship left. 5 of us: me, Nate, Mark, O'Leary, and Johnson. All of us were experienced in different fields: engineering, communications, mechanical repair. I'd done jobs in remote places before, but nothing like this. The moment the ship disappeared over the horizon, leaving us alone on this vast frozen continent, I felt a weight settle on my chest. The station was basic: just a few connected modules, a mess hall, a common room, and our bunks. Outside, nothing but endless white as far as the eye could see, the wind howling across the barren ice fields. At first, it was manageable. We set up routines, kept the place running, and spent our off hours playing cards, watching old movies, or chatting. The first signs of trouble were subtle. Nate, our head engineer, was always the quiet type, but after a month, he got quieter. He'd spend hours staring out the small window in the common room, watching the endless snowfall, his eyes glazed over. Sometimes I'd catch him muttering to himself, but when I asked him about it, he'd just shrug me off. "You hear that?" he asked me one night as we sat in the common room after dinner. "Hear what?" I replied. "That knocking. It's been happening every night." I listened, but all I could hear was the wind whipping against the walls. "It's just the wind, Nate," I said, trying to reassure him, but he didn't look convinced. He kept staring out the window, his face pale and drawn. The days blurred together, as they do out here. Without sunlight, it's impossible to tell where one day ends and the next begins. The isolation started getting to us in different ways. Johnson, our communications guy, started sleeping in late, barely leaving his bunk unless he had to. O'Leary became jumpy, always checking the locks on the doors, double and triple checking the inventory, like we were going to run out of supplies overnight. Mark was the only one who seemed unfazed. He was ex-military, the type of guy who could shut off his emotions at will. He kept his head down, did his work, and didn't complain. But even Mark started getting weird. I'd find him sitting alone in the dark sometimes, just staring at the walls, his jaw clenched tight, like he was trying to hold something back. The first real crack came in month 3. O'Leary woke us all up in the middle of the night, shouting about someone being inside the station. He was frantic, banging on doors, insisting that someone had broken in. When we finally calmed him down, he pointed to the common room window. "There was a face out there," he screamed, wild-eyed, his hands shaking. "I swear to God, there was someone out there, watching us." We all went to look, but of course there was nothing. Just snow, wind, and darkness. No tracks, no signs of life. Nate tried to reason with him, said it was probably his mind playing tricks on him. "The isolation gets to people," he said. "It's called cabin fever." But O'Leary wouldn't listen. He spent the rest of the night pacing, checking the doors and windows, muttering about the man outside. After that, things went downhill fast. The air inside the station grew heavy, suffocating. Conversations turned into arguments. Small irritations became full-blown fights. Nate's obsession with the knocking grew worse. Every night, he insisted it was getting louder, that someone, something, was outside, trying to get in. I tried to keep everyone calm, but it was like the air itself was turning poisonous, driving us all mad. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, sure that I'd heard footsteps in the hall, or whispers in the dark. I wasn't the only one. Johnson refused to sleep alone anymore. He claimed he heard someone breathing in the bunk next to his. But when he turned on the light, no one was there. Mark stayed the calmest, or at least he pretended to. But even he couldn't hide the dark circles under his eyes, or the way his hands shook when he thought no one was watching. The breaking point came in week 14. We'd all been on edge for days. No one was sleeping well, and the tension was unbearable. Then, one morning, O'Leary was missing. His bunk was empty, his boots gone. We searched the station, but there was no sign of him. Panic set in. Had he gone outside? Had he wandered off into the storm? We geared up and went out looking for him, but there were no tracks, no sign of him anywhere. It didn't make sense. There's nowhere to go out here, nowhere to hide. It was like he just vanished into thin air. When we came back inside, Nate snapped. He grabbed a wrench and started smashing the equipment, shouting about how they were coming for us next. We had to wrestle him to the ground, tie him up to stop him from hurting himself or anyone else. Johnson was sobbing by then, curled up in a ball in the corner, rocking back and forth, repeating O'Leary's name under his breath. That night, I heard the knocking. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but then it came again. A soft, rhythmic tapping coming from the walls. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay there, frozen in my bunk, listening. It couldn't be real. There was no one out there. There couldn't be. But then I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, moving through the halls. I wasn't the only one who heard it. I saw Mark get up from his bunk, his eyes wide with fear. We met in the hallway, both of us pale and shaking. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. He nodded, his hand tightening around the knife he'd started carrying. "It's real," he muttered. "There's something in here with us." We moved through the station, checking every room, every corridor, but we found nothing. The knocking stopped as soon as we started looking. By morning, Nate was dead. We found him hanging from the rafters in the mess hall, his face blue, his body swaying gently in the cold air. He'd managed to untie himself at some point during the night, snuck out while we were distracted. No note, no explanation. Just gone. Johnson broke down completely after that. He locked himself in his bunk room, refused to come out. Mark and I tried to keep it together, but it was hard. The station felt smaller, like the walls were closing in on us. The air was thick with fear and paranoia. The next night, I woke up to find Mark standing over my bed, the knife in his hand. "What the hell are you doing?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer. His eyes were vacant, like he wasn't even there anymore. He raised the knife, and I reacted without thinking, grabbing his wrist and shoving him back. We struggled, crashing into the wall, knocking over the small table beside my bunk. His grip was strong, stronger than I expected, but I managed to twist the knife out of his hand and throw him to the floor. "Mark, stop!" I shouted, but he just kept coming at me, wild-eyed, his hands clawing at my throat. In the end, I didn't have a choice. I grabbed the knife and drove it into his side. He gasped, his body going limp as the blood soaked through his shirt. I held him as he died, the last bit of life fading from his eyes. Now it's just me. Johnson's still locked in his room, but I haven't heard anything from him in days. Maybe he's already gone too. Maybe he just stopped. The knocking is back, louder this time, closer. I'm sitting in the common room, staring at the door, waiting for it to come. Whatever it is, I don't know if it's real anymore. I don't know what's real. The cold is creeping in, the generator's dying, and there's no one left. No one's coming for us. Not this far south. And the knocking won't stop. I never thought I'd see myself at the edge of the world, but that's where I ended up, working as a technician at Blackridge Station, one of the most remote outposts in Antarctica. Just a few of us, all men, stuck down here for the winter. We weren't scientists or explorers, just maintenance guys keeping the station running while the rest of the world forgot we existed. Antarctica changes you. There's no real sense of time. Just a constant cold and darkness. You lose track of how long it's been since you last saw the sun. The wind howls like a living thing, battering the station day and night. We were cut off, hundreds of miles from the nearest base, with nothing but the sound of the wind, the hum of the generators, and the occasional satellite ping. The isolation wasn't what I expected. I thought I'd be okay with it. I'm a pretty solitary guy. But it was different here. Everything felt amplified. The cold, the emptiness, the silence. Even with the others around, I felt like I was slowly being swallowed by the landscape. The station itself was old. Built in the 70s, it was a relic, patched up and held together by decades of wear and tear. There were 5 of us. Me, the lead technician, Harris, our cook, Simmons, a medic, and Miller and Shaw, 2 mechanics. It was routine work, monitoring systems, fixing the generators, making sure the heating stayed on. For the most part, things were fine. But after the first couple of months, the problems started. It was little stuff at first. The comms equipment would drop out for a few hours, but we were used to that. In this part of the world, you learn to expect bad signals and broken tech. Then the weather turned. Fierce storms rolling in, one after another, cutting visibility down to nothing. We couldn't even step outside without risking our lives. It didn't bother us much, though. We had everything we needed inside the station. But the generator started acting up about a week into the worst of the storms. Power would flicker at random intervals, plunging us into darkness for minutes at a time. We'd sit there, waiting for it to kick back in, while the wind pounded the walls. Harris joked that the place was haunted, that maybe we weren't the first ones to get stuck down here. We all laughed, but there was a nervousness to it, like we were trying too hard to ignore the fact that something wasn't right. One night, it all went to hell. I was on watch, sitting in the comms room when the power went out again. This time, it didn't come back. The station was plunged into pitch-black silence, the only sound the wind tearing at the walls. I grabbed my flashlight and headed to the generator room, expecting to find Miller or Shaw already there, trying to fix it. But when I got there, the room was empty. The generator was stone cold. I called out over the radio, but no one answered. My breath was clouding in front of me. It was getting cold fast. I tried to restart the generator, but nothing worked. I had to find the others. I made my way through the station, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. I called out, but the wind was so loud it swallowed my voice. Room after room was empty. No sign of Miller, Shaw, or Simmons. I started to panic, running down the narrow corridors, banging on doors, checking every corner. When I got to the kitchen, I found Harris slumped over the table. I rushed over, shaking him, but he didn't respond. His skin was pale, his eyes half open, staring at nothing. It took me a second to realize he wasn't breathing. I backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't understand. He'd been fine just hours ago. I checked for a pulse, but he was gone. Just like that. That's when I heard it. A noise from the back of the station, coming from the old storage area we barely used. It was faint at first, like metal scraping on metal. I thought maybe it was Shaw or Miller. Maybe they'd gotten trapped back there, and I could help. But as I moved closer, I realized it wasn't them. I stopped dead in the hallway, listening. The sound was rhythmic, steady, like something moving through the walls. I tried the door to the storage room, but it was jammed shut. I pounded on it, shouting their names, but no one answered. The scraping continued, slow and deliberate. I don't know how long I stood there, listening, trying to make sense of it. But the longer it went on, the more I realized there was something wrong with this place. Something beyond just mechanical failure or isolation madness. I backed away, retreating to the control room, trying to think clearly. I got on the radio again, but it was dead. No signal, no backup power. We were completely cut off. I tried to stay calm, telling myself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe the cold had gotten to Harris, maybe the others were still trying to fix the generator. But deep down, I knew something was very wrong. I huddled in the control room for what felt like hours, listening to the wind hammer against the station. The scraping noise had stopped, but the silence was worse. I didn't dare go back to the storage room. Whatever had been making that noise, it wasn't something I wanted to find. I waited for daylight, but it never came. It never does in the Antarctic winter. Eventually, I worked up the courage to check the station again. I found Shaw in his bunk, but he was dead too, just like Harris, cold and stiff with no signs of injury. Miller and Simmons were nowhere to be found. I tried to stay rational, tried to figure out what had happened. Maybe they'd gone outside, tried to escape, but in this storm, it didn't make sense. None of it made sense. I was alone now, with no power, no communication, and 3 dead crew members. The storm outside raged on. I locked myself in the control room, hoping for rescue, but knowing deep down that no one was coming. We were too far out, and no one would be checking in for weeks. As I write this, the scraping has started again. It's louder now, closer. I don't know what it is. Maybe the ice shifting. Maybe something worse. But it's coming for me. I can feel it in the walls, in the cold air, in the way the station seems to breathe around me. If anyone finds this, don't come here. Don't follow our signal. There's something in the ice, something ancient and patient, and it's waking up. The first thing you realize when you arrive in Antarctica is that the cold isn't just a sensation, it's a presence. It seeps into everything, filling every crack, every fiber of your clothing, until it feels like the air itself is pressing down on you. I wasn't a rookie, though. I knew what to expect. I'd been stationed at outposts before, but this time, something felt different. It was late winter when I got to Halley 6, the British research station perched precariously on the Brunt ice shelf. The sun had set weeks ago, and it wouldn't rise again for months. Darkness stretched endlessly, interrupted only by the distant glow of the aurora. The isolation was thick, oppressive, but we were used to it. This is what we signed up for. The crew was smaller this time. We were only 4. Me, the lead engineer, Tom, the station manager, Claire, a biologist, and Jake, the mechanic. The winter crew, keeping the base running while everyone else waited out the season back home. The work was routine, dull even. Maintenance checks, monitoring equipment, making sure the power stayed on. But there was one thing I'd been warned about, the ice beneath us. The Brunt's unstable, Tom had said on my first day. Shifts all the time. Just be prepared for a little creaking now and then. He wasn't kidding. At night, you could hear it. Long, low groans as the ice shifted, settling, moving like a living thing beneath our feet. It never bothered me before. But then, strange things started happening. It began with the power fluctuations. At first, it was just a few flickers here and there. Jake said it was probably the generator acting up. I trusted him. He knew the machines inside and out. But the flickers turned into full outages, sometimes for hours. We'd sit in the lounge, the emergency lights casting everything in an eerie red glow, waiting for Jake to fix whatever was going wrong. But every time, he'd come back shaking his head. "There's nothing wrong with it," he'd say. "I don't get it." The creaking of the ice started to get louder too. It wasn't just at night anymore. I'd be working in the lab or checking equipment, and I'd hear it. Long, drawn-out groans, like something massive and ancient was shifting beneath us. Claire said it was normal, that the ice shelf was always moving. But it didn't feel normal. One night, I woke up to a sound that made my blood freeze. It was like the creaking of the ice, but louder, deeper, like a roar coming from beneath the surface. I shot up in bed, heart pounding, listening. The station was quiet, except for the wind howling outside, but that sound, it stuck with me. The next morning, I asked the others if they'd heard it. Tom shrugged it off. Just the ice shelf doing its thing, he said, but I could see the unease in his eyes. Claire and Jake hadn't heard anything. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't get that noise out of my head. A few days later, Jake disappeared. It was routine maintenance. He'd gone outside to check the antenna during a storm. Nothing out of the ordinary, except he didn't come back. When he didn't answer his radio, we assumed he'd lost signal. Maybe he got turned around in the blizzard. We searched for hours, but all we found was his helmet, half buried in the snow near a crevasse. No tracks, no sign of him. The official report would say he fell, but I wasn't so sure. The ice had been shifting more, groaning louder, like something was stirring underneath. It felt like the ground was waiting for us to make a mistake. I could feel it, something below the ice, as if the whole shelf was covering something ancient, something that wasn't meant to be disturbed. After Jake vanished, things started getting worse. The power cuts became more frequent, and when they happened, the station would fill with a cold I'd never felt before. Not just cold air, but a biting, hollow chill, like the warmth was being sucked out of the walls, out of me. It left me shivering for hours after the lights came back on. Then, Claire started talking about the whispers. I was checking the generator when she found me, her face pale, eyes wide with fear. "Do you hear them?" she whispered. "Hear what?" I asked, though I already knew what she was going to say. "The voices, beneath the ice. I can hear them at night." I wanted to tell her it was just the wind, the groaning of the ice. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I'd heard them too, faint at first, like the echoes of distant conversations just below the edge of hearing. But they were getting louder. Tom didn't want to believe us. He said we were just getting stir-crazy, that the isolation was getting to us. He wouldn't even entertain the idea that something else was going on. But Claire and I, we knew better. There was something beneath the ice, something old and alive, and it was waking up. A week after Jake disappeared, we found the tunnel. It wasn't there before. I was checking the storage room when I noticed a draft coming from one of the walls. The shelf had shifted, revealing a narrow crack in the wall, a crack that led down. Claire and I looked at each other, fear etched in both of our faces. "What the hell is this?" she whispered. We should have reported it to Tom, but something stopped us. Maybe it was the whispers, or maybe it was just a gut feeling that this was something we weren't supposed to find. We grabbed flashlights and climbed down. The tunnel was tight, claustrophobic, descending into the ice like a throat swallowing us whole. The further we went, the colder it got. I swear I could hear the voices clearer now, whispering, urging us forward. At the bottom, we found a cavern. The walls shimmered with frost, and in the center was a hole, black and endless. It wasn't natural. The ice didn't form like this. It looked constructed, and from deep within that hole, I could hear them. The voices, clearer now, rising up like a chorus. "We need to leave," I said, pulling Claire back, but she was frozen in place, staring into the abyss. "It's calling to us." I grabbed her arm and we fled back to the surface, but the station wasn't safe anymore. The groaning of the ice had turned into a roar, the power cutting in and out, and the cold, that unbearable cold seeped into everything. Tom tried to get us to evacuate, but the storm was too strong. We were trapped. That night, the voices came for us. I woke up to Claire's screams. I ran to her room, but she wasn't there. The door was wide open, snow blowing in from the hall. I followed her tracks to the tunnel, but by the time I got there, she was gone, swallowed by the ice. Now it's just me. The storm is howling outside. The power's out, and the station feels like a tomb. The voices are louder now, clearer. They're calling me down, down into the ice where Claire and Jake went. I can't fight it anymore. Whatever's down there, it's been waiting for us, and now it's time. If you find this, don't come looking for me. Don't come here at all. There's something beneath the ice, and once it wakes up, it won't stop until it swallows us all. What do you think? Would you like to expand on any details or change parts of it? I was stationed at the Antarctic research base for the winter. It was supposed to be a routine assignment: data collection, environmental monitoring, and maintenance in the harsh, desolate landscape. The isolation was immense, with only a handful of other researchers sharing the base. Initially, the quiet, endless expanse of ice was oddly calming, a stark contrast to the hectic pace of city life. But that calm was deceptive. The first sign that something was wrong was the malfunctioning equipment. Our thermal sensors, crucial for monitoring the ice stability, began delivering erratic readings. At first, I dismissed it as a result of the extreme cold. However, as the malfunctions became more frequent, the easy explanations began to crumble. As the weeks passed, the situation grew stranger. We started hearing eerie noises at night, strange creaks and thumps that resonated through the empty corridors. They were subtle at first, like the faint echoes of distant machinery, but soon they became more pronounced. I would lie awake in my bunk, trying to pinpoint the source of the sounds, only to find everything in place when I investigated. The isolation of the base began to weigh heavily on me. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional burst of wind or the rhythmic hum of the base's generators. It wasn't just the physical isolation, it was the psychological effect of being cut off from the outside world. The feeling of being watched crept up gradually. It wasn't just a fleeting thought, it was a persistent, gnawing sensation that made me feel like there were eyes following me wherever I went. To combat the growing unease, the team and I tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy. We held briefings, engaged in small talk, and even organized occasional social activities. But the disturbances didn't abate. The equipment continued to malfunction, and the noises became more intrusive. It was clear that something was fundamentally wrong, but we had no idea what it was. One particularly cold night, the base's power flickered and went out completely. The darkness was absolute, punctuated only by the dim glow of emergency lights. The power outage was followed by a series of loud bangs and metallic crashes. We scrambled to restore the power, but when the lights came back on, I noticed a door in the back of one of the storage rooms, a door that hadn't been there before. I hesitated, but decided to investigate. My curiosity was matched only by my growing sense of dread. I pried open the door, revealing a hidden room. It was dusty and filled with discarded equipment and old files. In the corner, covered in a thick layer of dust, was an old monitoring station. I powered it up, half expecting it to be non-functional. To my surprise, the screens flickered to life, displaying real-time footage of various parts of the base. The sight was both fascinating and terrifying. The cameras had been recording us, our every move, our conversations, our most private moments. I was horrified to see that the footage was not just routine surveillance. It included footage of us in our most vulnerable moments, unaware that we were being watched. The shadows on the footage seemed to move on their own, adding to the eerie atmosphere. I reviewed the footage with increasing dread. The monitoring station had captured everything, including moments when shadows seemed to shift and distort just out of view. I couldn't determine if these anomalies were the result of faulty equipment or something more sinister. I tried to confront the others about my discovery, but they were dismissive. Their reactions were oddly calm, almost as if they were expecting this discovery. My attempts to report the findings were thwarted when the communication system went down. An inconvenient coincidence or deliberate sabotage? The days dragged on, and the sense of unease grew. The base, once a place of scientific study, felt more like a prison. The feeling of being watched was relentless. I found myself jumping at every sound, my mind constantly on edge. The psychological strain was immense, exacerbated by the isolation and the knowledge that we had been under surveillance. I began to question everything. Every shadow, every sound, every creak of the ice outside seemed to have a sinister meaning. The paranoia was consuming me. I couldn't trust my own senses. The base's routines, once a source of comfort, became a reminder of my confinement. One night, the base's alarm system went off. The blaring sirens were a jarring disruption, and we scrambled to assess the situation. Everything appeared normal. No breaches, no malfunctions. Yet the alarm had been triggered, and the sense of foreboding deepened. The discovery of the abandoned monitoring station weighed heavily on me. I found more hidden compartments in the base, each revealing old documents and more footage. The files suggested that the surveillance was part of a larger, unknown study. But the details were vague and inconclusive, leaving me with more questions than answers. The isolation and psychological strain began to affect the entire team. We started to argue more, our interactions becoming strained. The once friendly banter turned into accusations and paranoia. The base, once a place of scientific collaboration, had become a breeding ground for mistrust. I tried to reach out to the higher-ups, but my communications were cut off. The base's external links were dead, leaving us isolated, not just physically, but also from any potential outside help. It was as if we were cut off from the rest of the world, our only connection to it severed. As the weeks dragged on, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The base seemed to close in on us, the ice outside a constant reminder of our isolation. The psychological toll was immense. The boundaries between reality and paranoia began to blur. I questioned my own sanity, wondering if the surveillance was a figment of my imagination or if something more sinister was at play. One night, I had a vivid dream. In it, the base was filled with shadows, and I was being pursued by an unseen entity. I woke up in a cold sweat, the dream leaving me shaken. The lines between dream and reality began to blur, and I struggled to differentiate between the two. The final piece of the puzzle came when I discovered more files detailing various experiments and observations conducted on the base. The files suggested that the surveillance was part of a larger unknown study, but the details were vague and inconclusive. The sense of dread intensified as I realized that we might have been part of a dangerous experiment. The base became a place of torment. The ice outside was no longer a beautiful landscape. It was a prison, a barrier separating us from the outside world. The isolation and surveillance had transformed the base into a chamber of psychological horror. The lines between reality and fear were blurred, leaving me grappling with the unsettling possibility that the surveillance might never end. As I write this, I am left with more questions than answers. The base remains operational, but the sense of dread lingers. I don't know if we were part of an experiment or if something more sinister was at play. All I know is that the feeling of being watched never left me, and the Antarctic winter has become a never-ending nightmare.